Um, the Facebook Live sound for home.
Yeah, can I get it?
Testing 1, 2. Let's make sure everybody at home can hear this. If anyone is at home, we're glad you're there. We're doing a little testing. Testing 1, 2, and then we hope this mic out in the middle works.
Do you want me to move this a little bit closer?
Oh, I can. Should I be closer?
Just a little
Okay.
bit, yeah.
Be closer to the mic. Thank you. Now I can go back to sleep. Well, welcome. Welcome. We're glad if anybody is at home watching, we're glad you're out there, either this morning or later in the week as you're chiming in. We're here at First Presbyterian Church in York, Pennsylvania. And we know a few friends can't make it into the Sunday school class. We've been doing this class where we've been highlighting different figures from the past, or sometimes the not too distant past, a few people that are still alive, as we've looked at church history, so to speak, and particularly how different key figures throughout church history have understood the Bible and how the scriptures have shaped them. It's one of the key sort of things that have been a common, in different ways, but still a common thread that people of great faith who have rocked the world, as we put it, have engaged the scriptures well. We've looked at John Calvin. We've looked at Martin Luther. We've looked at contemporary figures like Alan Bozak. We've looked at Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, Eugene Peterson. Stephanie did a great class on the Wesleys from the 1700s. So we've jumped around through church history trying to alert people to great heroes of the faith who trusted in God's grace and were committed to God's word. Today we're going to try to pack a whole lot in. We're doing 3 different people, and I'm going to do the first part, and then Emily Clark is going to come up and share about 2 ancient women, doctors of the church, as they're sometimes called in the Catholic tradition, saints, who were medieval mystics. She'll tell you about them. Fascinating people we should know, and you could do a whole class on either one of them. However, we're going to start off by looking at a more contemporary woman who was in fact influenced by Teresa of Avila and Teresa of Lisieux. These 2 women we're going to hear about in a bit. And the woman that was so influenced by them is a colorful character that is one of my heroes and a person we could spend weeks on, and her name is Dorothy Day. I don't know how many have heard of Dorothy Day. There's a new book about her by D.L. Mayfield called Unruly Saint. She is in the process of being canonized by the Catholic Church, but it's unclear whether her people want that, whether she'll make it because of the miracle question. To be a saint, you have to do miracles. So this is Dorothy Day's Radical Vision, and it's challenged for our times by Mayfield, and it is really, really a good biography. And a bit of a memoir of how a contemporary evangelical Protestant woman who's worked with refugees a good chunk of her life has drawn inspiration from Dorothy Day, who died in 1980 in New York. The bigger definitive biography of her is called Dorothy Day, Dissenting Voice of the American Century. It is an incredibly thorough historical book, really, really good. I reviewed it in our Book Notes newsletter. Since we're friends, I can brag. And the author said it was the best review he'd seen, even though it had been reviewed in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then when the paperback came out, they have a blurb of mine in the back here. So it says Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, because I put my review in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette as well. So this is my little claim to fame on Dorothy Day. Here's a little collection of her writings. She wrote 4 major memoirs and was a journalist at a newspaper, so she wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of letters and so forth. But this little book, The Reckless Way of Love, published by Plow Publishing from the Bruderhof. That's a nice little collection. So there's resources around if you want to know more of who Dorothy Day was. I'm going to just give you an overview of her life, what a stimulating, complex character she was, and we'll just say briefly that she was influenced deeply by these 2 Catholic saints, and then we'll shift, and Emily will come up and get to the heart of today's program. Let me just say this. Dorothy Day was born in 1897. That's amazing that she was born in the late 1800s and died in 1980. She had come to Pittsburgh when I was living there. I almost had a chance to meet her, and I didn't go to the event, and I've been kicking myself ever since. She had a spiritual director there, a guy named Father Hugo, who did silent retreats, and she would come sort of undercover from her New York urban ministry to retreat in Pittsburgh. And so we got her in Pittsburgh to do a program once while she was there. Her story is remarkable because she was born, came of age in the early 1900s, fairly middle-class family, raised Episcopalian, but it was so nominal they never went to church. So she was essentially unchurched, but read the Bible as a kid. And she loved reading, and she loved the Bible. She loved Russian fiction, which stayed with her her entire life. She loved poetry. She read literature. And she was drawn particularly to Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, about the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and those kind of people that became known as muckrakers, investigative journalism that would stir the pot, and many of them were very far left politically. And she became a socialist and a communist. Technically, she was an anarchist, didn't believe in the government at all, greatly influenced by Lenin. She had met Trotsky, Marx's friend Trotsky. She met him early on. Upton Sinclair, these other sort of radical political figures. She went to college for a bit, but spent her scholarship on books and read Russian fiction and political journalism and dropped out of college, so she never finished her college career. In 1917, she was agitating around social change and doing the political stuff that anarchists and political people did, particularly in those days, protests and so forth. And she joined the suffragettes protesting at the White House for the vote for women, and knew some of the leading figures in the suffragette movement. Undertook a fast when she was arrested there for 10 days and was beat up, almost killed by police. She wasn't raped, but some of the other women were. It was a horrific. And President Wilson got them out of jail, even though it was his shenanigans in a certain sense that got them in jail. But he was so, Woodrow Wilson was so struck by how abused they were that he got them out of jail. But that was her world. Radical, far left, political, arrests, protesting, hanging out with the poor, hanging out with the union workers. She traveled to become a journalist for communist newspapers, studying labor uprisings. She went to Pittsburgh with the coal miners and other kind of places where there were workers that were truly oppressed in those days, the slum houses, the tenements. You've heard of Jane Addams. She knew Jane Addams. So she was part of this early 20th century desire to change the world, both politically, but then started hanging around as she got a bit older with artists and bohemians, had a very good friendship with Eugene O'Neill, who won the Pulitzer Prize in Literature back in those days, Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, other playwright, theater people, poets. She knew everybody. It was remarkable, and she could drink them all under the table when they would go to their drinking all-night parties. She remained a virgin, although advocated free sexuality in those days. But her commitment to the Bible gave her a sense of right and wrong, and eventually she fell in love, got pregnant, had an abortion, which she regretted. She worked for a number of newspapers doing this investigative journalism stuff, and was increasingly drawn to questions of right and wrong, and consequently to questions of spirituality. What is true? She had guilt over the abortion, fell in love another time, had another pregnancy, and would not get an abortion, even though her bohemian boyfriend wanted her to. She was deeply in love. They lived in Staten Island at the time. They had moved to New York, working with the labor unions, working with the poor, working with the disenfranchised. She was always taken by how poorer folks, immigrants particularly in New York, Italians and Jews and Eastern Europeans and Russians, sort of cared for their own, so to speak. How the government programs weren't as important as just people helping one another. And so she had this personal, individual sort of caring. And it became eventually, after she became a Christian, became known as a personalism or sort of a third way between capitalism and communism, where you actually cared for each other individually. Her anarchist roots were still there. Well, after she had the baby, Tamar is her name, only child she had, the husband would not marry her, or the boyfriend would not marry her. And she was going through what later she called a long loneliness. Busy, 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 organizing around the world, traveling around justice issues, standing for the poor, going to work with Martin Luther King in the Deep South. She went to Koinonia Farms, the Southern Baptist guy that started Koinonia in Americus, Georgia, was shot at, had to hide behind her car. I mean, she lived a dramatic, dramatic life, but she was hungering out of this long loneliness for a deeper relationship. And long story short, we could write a whole book just about this, but she became Roman Catholic. She committed herself to Christ. She joined the Catholic Church. She had Tamar baptized. Her Bohemian friends couldn't believe it, that she would go for something as rigid as the Catholic institution. And her left-wing friends couldn't believe it because the Catholic Church was on the rise and oppressive often and pro-war and so forth. She became a pacifist. She began to take Jesus literally. She studied the early church fathers and mystics, which we'll hear about in a minute, many of whom lived in voluntary poverty, like St. Francis. A simple lifestyle to have solidarity with the poor. And she came across an early church father who said, essentially quoting John the Baptist, by the way, if you have more than one coat, the other one is stolen from the poor. In other words, the poor have rights to your stuff if you have more than you need. She took that to heart and started a movement of simplicity and pacifism that welded her anarchistic left-wing background with conservative Catholicism. She ran toe-to-toe with a lot of the bishops around the country, but would always submit to what they believed. Once she was hanging around with the left wing, this is sort of parenthetical, but the left wing, peacemaking, anti-war priests, the Berrigan brothers, Daniel and Philip Berrigan. And Daniel was a Jesuit and was having a little alternative mass for their community. He was wearing stoles, but not the full regalia that priests are supposed to wear. And Dorothy sat him down and said, "We will not take communion until you put on your vestments." So she was a traditionalist in many ways and even yelled at Dan Berrigan. Thomas Merton, the great mystic, published in her newspaper that she started called the Catholic Worker, which was a play on the Communist Worker newspaper that was passed out in Union Square at the rallies. Tens of thousands of people would show up at left-wing rallies on May Day and stuff, from those days, the unions and stuff. And she wanted a Catholic alternative to that. So she started the Catholic Worker newspaper and would start quoting the Bible and the Catholic saints and the medieval mystics, and developed what she came eventually to learn about as the social ethics of the Catholic Church. What Reverum Novarum said, Pope Leo in the 1800s about the poverty and the systemic injustices. She drew on Martin Luther King. She drew on Southern tier theologians that were beginning to become known from Central America, but mostly she stood on the Catholic tradition of concern for the poor. As I said, she knew Emma Goldman and Jane Addams and stuff in an earlier life, Eugene O'Neill, but she didn't actually leave that behind. She stayed in touch with some of those folks in the middle of the 20th century. But in 1927 is when she was actually baptized. The newspaper became immediately popular. She began to travel all over the country. The paper had tens of thousands of subscriptions. And she started eking out this tradition known as Catholic Worker houses, which were houses of hospitality where the homeless could come in and get food and housing. They were notoriously ill-run. They were broke. They would have hundreds of people in a flat that was supposed to have 10. They would turn no one away. She eventually raised a little money and went to visit Mother Teresa late in her life to see how Mother Teresa did it at the height of India. We had a program on Mother Teresa here that Kyle did. She admired Mother Teresa, but she was doing with a bit of political edge. She was doing the same sort of thing, and Catholic workers' houses sprung up all over the country in cities, and they're still around. There's one in Harrisburg. one in Baltimore. And they were communities of people who were idealistic, committed to the poor, standing out against any social injustices, running newspapers, having daily mass, and letting anybody come in, no questions asked. Never any judgment, never any questions. And so consequently, the big houses in New York, particularly into the 60s and 70s, became almost overrun with mental illness, with people who had drug abuse, with violence, and she ran it all and wrote about it. I'll just tell you this one little story. Or just one other little episode. There was a guy who was from Europe named Peter Maurin, who showed up in her life and taught her much about the Catholic social tradition. He was an intellectual, owned nothing, was a hobo, and lived at the house except when he would go out on the roads or the trains. And he was brilliant, and he wanted his little essays called Easy Essays, they're almost poems, to be published in the Catholic Worker, which she published. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie based on Dorothy Day called Entertaining Angels, but Martin Sheen delightfully plays the role of this colorful character, Peter Maurin. And I've talked to Sheen about this. It's just one of his favorite roles in a little underground film about Dorothy Day. But Martin Sheen plays the role of Peter Maurin, who died in the 70s, I think. She met him in 1932. So she's sort of a character of the entire 20th century. She started these houses, of which there are hundreds of Catholic worker houses, caring for the poor in utter simplicity and radical Catholicism. She was arrested bunches of times for nonviolent civil disobedience. Like in 1955, they were insisting in New York that everyone practiced the destruction of the war from atomic bombs as if going into the subways would save you, which everyone knew it wouldn't. And it was by law, everyone would have to go in when they would put the sirens in. And she and her community would go to the park with a picnic and say no, they would not go. Because one, the government doesn't have the right to tell you to do those things, but more importantly, because this was some sort of complicity in this madness of nuclear arms race, and to say no to that, they would just say, no, we're not going to cooperate with this practicing and have everyone like sheep go into the underground shelters. So they were arrested often. This was in the 1950s. When Vatican II was going on, the big changes in Rome that went on for years, these big meetings, they went and had a fast, almost died, she fasted so long, in the Vatican, praying for peace, and that nonviolence would become the Catholic position. And it isn't exactly, but some of the peace emphasis in Vatican II came in part from Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. I mentioned she hung around with the Berrigan brothers. In the 1970s, she started hanging around with Cesar Chavez, of course, the alternative Catholic labor union for Latinos that were growing the farms, the grapes and lettuce boycotts, some of you may recall. She was a leader in that and was arrested out there for picketing nonviolently, and the cops, of course, would beat up anybody that they didn't like out there with the farm workers. And so she went to jail with farm workers. It was in 71, I think, was when she visited Mother Teresa. And while she was on the trip to Mother Teresa, she went to visit Solidarity, the union in Poland. She loved unions. The union in Poland that was resisting the communists. Remember that? Lech Walesa, some of you may recall. And she was networking with them. So anywhere around the world where there were Catholic leaders changing the world through nonviolent social action and solidarity with the poor, she was somehow connected. In a sense, she was an unruly saint, as the one book puts it, because she just wouldn't cooperate and be nice. She was always agitating everywhere she went. She met Solzhenitsyn, who was imprisoned in Siberia. No, she didn't meet him. She went to Russia to advocate for him. Her last public appearance was on the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, when there was a large Eucharistic Congress in the Catholic faith in Philadelphia. It was in 1976, and she spoke out about the bad mixture of church and state that was embellishing civil religion in those days and calling people back to Jesus. Her favorite Bible verses included Isaiah 58, where it says that you should, this is the fast that I choose. You want to fast? You should fast for justice and bring the homeless poor into your own home and pay your workers a fair wage. Read Isaiah 58. James 5 says, almost sounding like Isaiah, would say, How, you rich who do not pay your workers fair? How? The brother of Jesus telling the rich to just cry out because of their injustices. Matthew 25, of course, comes to mind, what you do to the least of these. So she loved the scriptures. She loved the church fathers. She loved the agitating efforts of a transforming kind of faith in this uniquely anarchistic Catholic way that was deeply involved with the poor 24/7. She was never a monk or a nun, but she was drawn to those nuns that had renounced everything. There were two particular nuns from the Middle Ages that most influenced her. And so we would just like to hold up Dorothy Day as one example of a person who read deeply in church history and was so transformed by it. So what we really want to do is we want to have Emily come up and tell us about these two great Catholic saints and their love of God and their love of the Word. So if you would come up, we'll just shift entirely. We said we're packing a lot in today. Dorothy Day was one character, and now we're going to go back a couple centuries and learn about some women named Teresa. Tell people at home if they have any questions, they can write them.
Do. Okay. Well, hi everybody. I was excited to have a chance to speak about a couple of women in the church who were really foundational to a lot of people who have really done some amazing things. And this is an interesting juxtaposition of Dorothy Day with these two women. I'll also add that, our Saint Teresa also was inspired by these Teresas as well. So Byron wants me to make sure you know that he's still manning the computer, and if you have questions or comments, that he will let me know. And so let's begin and talk a little bit about these two. The two saints I'm going to be talking about are Teresa de Avila, who is Spanish, and Therese de Lisieux, who is a French woman. They are both, as Byron mentioned, doctors of the church. There are 4 women who are doctors of the church. This is a position in a label of the Catholic Church. And to be a doctor of the church, you have to be someone who is considered as having a body of teachings that are significant to inform the Catholic faith. And both of these women are doctors of the church, and Teresa de Avila was one of the first. So let's begin with her. She was, just for the sake of, let's see, Kyle's giving me a little instruction here, so let's see if I can make this happen. Hopefully. All right, Kyle, I'm failing. I turned it on. It's not going. Thank you. Okay, so here we have a painting. Oh, is everyone? Okay, good, thanks. So this is a painting of Teresa de Avila. She was born in 1515. So what's interesting to note about the span of her life, she lived until 1582, I apologize. So her placement in life was a time of turmoil and reform. So just as a review, we have the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther putting the 95 Theses on the door. That was 1517. And Henry VIII, all the upheaval in the Church of England was 1534. And then you have the Council of Trent, which was an effort by the Catholic Church to look at all this Reformation that's going on and how they're going to address it. And that happened in 3 sessions between 1545 and 1563. So you can see that she was living, and I have a little timeline of her life here that we're going to use just as a bit of a structure of how we're going to talk about her. That she was living in a time where there was a lot of religious upheaval going on. And in an interesting article that Byron sent to me, there was a point made that one of the things that Dorothy Day felt that she had in common with this Teresa was that they both were functioning at a time when there was a lot of watching of what they were saying going on, and that that Dorothy Day and Teresa both had to hold their work to a very high standard because the governments of their time were watching what was going on. And so obviously Dorothy Day was existing during McCarthyism, and so she, had to be very careful that the work she was doing and her adherence to the doctrine of the church kept on a very narrow path, and that influenced part of what was driving her. In the same way, we have Teresa de Avila, who was, coming out of a period of time, related to the Inquisition and related to all of this upheaval that was going on that caused her to also have to be very thoughtful and true to the teachings of the church. So, in Teresa's life, the early death of her mother in 1529 was a huge upheaval in her life. And she was, which is actually interesting and is true, it's also true of Teresa de Lisieux. Both of these women lost their mothers early. And Teresa de Avila was but she had been raised by her mother, who was a very strong Christian, and grew up in a household where this was very central to her being. There's a story about her taking her brother, I think his name was Rodrigo, and going outside the city gates because they decided that the best way to get to heaven was to be martyred. And they were going to the land of the Moors, and fortunately their uncle just came by and was like, "What are you two doing?" And they explained, and they took them back home. So she, from a very early age, had a sense that she was being called to sainthood and being called to the church. And she was a very, very stubborn young woman. So when she decided in 1535 that she wanted to join the convent, despite the fact that her father did not wish that of her, she went anyway. Her young years were really troubled by, not really troubled, but she was in a society, in the years after her mother died, she became very involved in reading, novels and paying attention to fashion and looking at herself in the mirror and being very conscious of all these worldly things. And when she joined the convent, she found herself in a situation that she realized over time was really not what it should be. That oftentimes the convents at this point were a place where the well-to-do put their daughters. And as in this particular convent in Avila, where she was, which was part of the Carmelite order, there was a great deal of socialization going on. That the nuns were there, and they would be hosting these afternoons of tea or whatever. And I'm exaggerating, but social things, and people would come, and there was talk, and there was really not an adherence to her religious life. And she rejected that. Now, this was coming out of a period of time that she had. After she joined the church, she went through a period of great deal of illness, and during that time entered some practices that were very self-challenging. She recognized herself as a sinner, and there was some practices of flagellation going on, but one of the things she was most known for was her practice of contemplative, they would call it a mindful prayer. That she would sit and really contemplate Jesus and his suffering. And while I don't have a lot of Bible verses for her, I think that the fact that she was very focused on Jesus during the Passion and his time of suffering as something that really informed her is a really essential idea here. So she comes to the realization that what's happening in the Carmelite order is not really up to snuff, and starts to do some reforming, and becomes the head of a movement that are called Discalced, which means shoeless Carmelites, and pushes for simplicity and withdrawal, and gets, early on, there's some turmoil around it because people are this is a change, and there's always, conflict with that. But she got permission to open St. Joseph's Convent, and began a practice, a renewed commitment to this idea of simplicity and austerity, and just living a life that was very limited. And if I don't have my two saints mixed up, I believe that within her, within the convent, there was, there was not a lot of heat. There was, practice of eating during certain months of the year, only having one meal a day. There was some real austerity going on. But the work that she's doing takes hold, and she gets the attention of some of the people in the Catholic Church who have influence, and she's asked to travel around Spain and open more convents. And also, she's given license to have some influence in the monasteries where the men are. And so she begins to travel around. In her lifetime, she went to all the different provinces of Spain. And of course, if you think about travel in the 1500s, you're dealing with, unpaved roads and a lot of physical trauma and stress, really, to do this kind of traveling. But she does travel, and she meets in one of her travels the gentleman who later in life would be known as St. John of the Cross, who is also a mystic. And he and she become friends, and he moves on to begin doing some of the same work Teresa is doing in the convents, in the monasteries. So they were very much contemporaries, very much partners, had contact throughout their lives, and actually were sainted. Actually, I don't know if they were made doctors of the church, or I think they were made doctors of the church at the same time. So these two were together. In 1575, there becomes this conflict where she is challenged. This is coming out a little bit of this kind of feeling of the Inquisition and this, adherence to what's going on and the turmoil that's caused by the work that she's doing. And she's told that she has to stop and retire to the convent. And John of the Cross is actually imprisoned in 1577. And there's a period of time where they really are called into non-practice. But the king at the time, and King Philip, and the Pope at the time resolve the conflict, see the value of their work, and invite her to continue her work. So within her life, 16 convents in total that she opened. During the time from 1583 to 1588, she wrote about her life and her experiences. Two of her most well-known works are The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle, both of which are books about the stages of spiritual growth and development. She was really known for having this way of wisdom and poetry about her, and when she was in the convents, people would come to the gate of the convent and seek advice from her, and she was very well known for being a woman of wisdom and great insight.
And those books are still considered classics.
Yes, they are. I'm sorry, and I'm sure Byron could provide them for you, or they may even be in the church library. So these are still books that are influencing and there are others, but these are the two.
Dorothy Day read them, which was transformed by them.
Thank you.
So they're heavy.
And yes, they are. They're very dense. Dorothy Day read them. They are because she's a teacher, a doctor of the church. These are core to Catholic reading and knowledge and understanding her works. But she does travel on the way to another convent opening or development and becomes ill and passes away in that area in 1582. Becomes canonized later in 1622. And for those of you who don't know much about that, which I didn't, there's a whole process by which your life is looked at, and you have to prove that the intervention that you have, that particular saint has intervened after death in the lives of people in miracles. So to become I think to be beautified, or whatever the term is, you have to have 2 miracles, but to become a saint, you have to have 4, and then obviously the status of being a doctor of the church is even higher than that, beyond that. So, but a little commentary that I read on her is just a good description. Teresa was a woman for God, a woman of prayer, discipline, and compassion. Her heart belonged to God. Her ongoing conversion was an arduous, lifelong struggle involving ongoing purification and suffering. She was misunderstood, misjudged, and opposed in her efforts at reform, yet she struggled on, courageous and faithful. She struggled with her own mediocrity, her illness, her opposition, and in the midst of all this, she clung to God in a life of prayer. Her writings on prayer and contemplation are drawn from her experience, powerful, practical, and graceful. She was a woman of prayer and a woman of God. And then another commentary was, Teresa was a woman for others. Though a contemplative, she spent much of her time and energy seeking to reform herself and the Carmelites, to lead them back to the full observance of the primitive rule. She founded over a half dozen new monasteries, traveled, wrote, fought, always to renew, to reform. In herself, in her prayer, in her life, in her efforts to reform, and in all the people she touched, she was a woman for others, a woman who inspired and gave life. And another commentary said, for Teresa, love meant constructive action. So you can see that her early years, the death of her mother, and her mother's Christian guidance, but then the loss of that mother and her turn toward these worldly things that she knew there was a leaning and a propensity to throughout her life, yet she fought it through her own personal prayer practice, for her call of herself and the other nuns to a life of simplicity and austerity, the action that she took to show her devotion to Jesus through her contemplation of his suffering and all, to take action and form these convents, always in love to God, and always struggling to reform. And you can see how this would so be reflected in the life of Dorothy Day. And now I'm going to go on. Does anybody have any questions about her before I move along?
Let me make a quick comment.
Yeah, please do,
I
Barney.
was so intrigued that she had this period when she was interested in fashion.
Yeah.
And you said she struggled with that throughout her life, this sort of tension between wanting to own a lot of stuff and be pretty. Dorothy Day struggled with that as well.
Interesting.
Although she was committed radically to deep simplicity and giving everything away. She loved beauty,
Bring this over so
which
you-
is one of the reasons she liked the novels of Dostoevsky, who said once that beauty will save the world. So that's just.
Do you want to read that one?
Oh, I think that.
Did you get it?
should pick up.
Okay, good. Well, that might be there.
I'm hoping it picks it up.
I apologize.
So yeah, this idea that beauty will save the world. Dorothy struggled with that there was some sort of sense. She said every woman needs a good dress. You know, Dorothy Day said that. So yeah, there's some similarities there.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Their struggle with the tension of the world and the world's influence and the legitimate goodness of beauty. That's interesting.
So our second saint here is Therese de Lisieux. She was French. Let's see if I can make that go. Now, interestingly enough, she lived a little bit later. Her life spanned 1873 to 1897. And as such, there are actually photographs of her. And one of the things that's a little bit of interest is that she ended up, in her living in the convent, she ended up with her sisters in the convent with her. And one of her sisters had a love of photography and was allowed to bring the camera to the convent. So if you ever decide you want to know more about her, you can go online and see photograph after photograph of Therese herself and life at the convent and what things looked like at that time, which is sort of an interesting little side note. So, Therese de Lisieux, obviously coming out of France, she was raised by two very, very profoundly Catholic faithful parents. Her father was a watchmaker and had hoped to go into monastery, but because he did not know Latin and because he had, I took it maybe that he had a little bit a difficulty learning the language, and I don't know whether he had a learning disability of some sort, but he could not learn Latin and so could not enter the monastery. And the mother, who had also hoped to go into religious life, was discouraged from that as well. And so despite the fact that her parents did not enter the monastery and the convent, they were extremely devoted to their Catholic faith and brought her, Therese and her sisters, up in a very, very faithful household with a lot of service to the poor, a lot of practice of worship, and all that would bring with it. And actually, interestingly, her parents were canonized, I don't have the year, but it was much later, 2015. And they are the only married couple in the Catholic tradition to be canonized. There's proof of miracles coming from them. And so I thought that was a really interesting addition. So Therese also loses her mother And this is a real blow for her. She apparently was a very emotional young person. A lot of tears and histrionics and sadness in her life, and this started with the death of her mother. But, her life really was a bit of a challenge because after her mother died, her sister Pauline stepped in as a surrogate mother. But Pauline entered the convent in 1882, and that was a second loss for her. And then she had another sister who joined the convent after a little bit. So, so sort of 3 times in a row she had this woman in her life who was mother and then acting mother who left. And so they talk about how she was very devoted to Mary as, a mother figure in her life. So she had something called that they described being nervous tremors. And this is something she suffered with for several years, really horrifically. And there is a miracle story of her lying in her bed and looking at a statue of Mary. And she saw Mary smile at her. The statue smiled. And at that moment, she was healed of her nervous tremors. And this was one of her foundational stories. Her moments of First Communion and confirmation were moments of deep religious significance to her. But she continued to struggle with this emotional, it had a self-centered basis. Everything that hurt her or made her sad, she would be upset about it, and there were a lot of tears and all this. But there was a moment in 1886, she had what they called a Christmas conversion, where she heard her exhausted father comment about how Therese was getting too old for the practice of putting out, I guess it was the shoes with the hope that the baby Jesus would bring gifts, and that, that he knew that would soon be over. And and she had this recognition of how tired and exhausted her father was, and something changed within her. She had this miracle of realizing that it really basically wasn't all about her, and that in putting herself aside, she could act in love towards others. And she went down and had this joyous moment of opening these gifts and thanking her father for everything, and just wanting to bring him joy in her joyfulness around these gifts that had been given her. And it was a change of heart that she brought forward into her life moving forward, which was very much a life of trying to become less as Christ became more in her. So she decides that she wants to join the convent. And she's very young, she's 15. And so she goes to the local, whoever it is that makes these decisions. This person says no. And she proceeds to push for it to an extent where when her family goes to have an audience with Pope Leo VIII, she speaks to the Pope openly about her desire to join the convent. And he says, well, you must do what you're told to do, basically. And she makes such a scene that the guards have to come and carry her off. She's a very strong-willed young lady. And so she does. She convinces those around her to let her enter at a very young age, and moves through the practices of the convent. Although what's interesting is that she had 4 sisters and a cousin, 3 sisters and a cousin who ended up in the convent with her, and her sister Pauline becomes head mother, and as such, they ask her if she will become a novice indefinitely, that she will never, enter those later stages of being in the practice of being a nun, because in part there's a recognition that basically there's a lot of power in her family, that this convent only, I believe, had 25 women in it, and 5 of them were from her family. So there's a place where she stays as a novice. And this is important too. So what overall happens with Therese is that she develops a value around becoming less and less and smaller in the face of wanting Jesus to become larger and larger in her life. She has learned through this moment of Christian conversion that this is what she's called to do. And when she enters the convent, she takes on the name of Saint Teresa of the Child of Jesus and of the Holy Face. And one of the practices, I guess the Veil of Veronica, which I know nothing about, was in the area, and that the practice of looking at Jesus' face on the cross was a common way to do a devotion. And she wrote about how she so desired her own face to become less her own face and more the face of Jesus. So it was her goal to grow in her her desire of becoming smaller and smaller. And one of the very important things that we know about Teresa is that she had something that she wrote about called the Little Way. And this is a little verse. Let me see if we can find this, make sure I've got it straight. And this brings out one of the key Bible verses for her. So this is her description of the little way. She describes it, her desire to become a saint and to be saintly. She describes an elevator in the home of a rich person. She continues, I want to find an elevator which would raise me to Jesus, for I am too small to climb the rough stairway of perfection. I searched in the scriptures from some sign of this elevator, the object of my desire, and I read these words coming from the mouth of eternal wisdom. Whoever is a little one, let him come to me. And that's Proverbs 9:4. The elevator which must raise me to heaven is in your arms, O Jesus, and for this I have no need to grow up, but rather I have to remain little and become this more and more. So she abandoned herself to Jesus, and her life became a continual acceptance of the will of the Lord. So it wasn't so much that her practices were like little, but that she recognized that she needed to become like a child in the arms of Jesus and allow him to raise her up. She's got another little comment that she makes here. She was struck by another passage from the book of Isaiah. This is Isaiah 66. You shall be carried at the breast, and upon the knees they shall caress you. As one whom the mother caresses, so will I comfort you. So again, this idea of just being a baby and a child in Christ, and have a a childlike simplicity in faith to enable her to move through life. And one of her practices of the little way was to try and make herself less and less, as I mentioned before. And she wrote often about how the trials of being in the convent and just always trying to take herself out of the situation and not express her small annoyances or her small petty things. And there's one story about how they were at the pool washing clothes, and one of the other nuns was splashing her and kept whapping whatever it was she was doing in her face, and how it took her this inner strength to just not say anything and just live with it. And again, in some of the readings that Byron shared with me about Dorothy Day wrote about this recognition of, they wrote about Dorothy Day saying that much of her life living in these houses in the city where all of these people who were distressed and underserved and overprivileged and ill were living, that she too had to learn how to take on this sense of self and this practice of letting go of her own petty, desires and wanting to rise up and, frustrations, but really living this way of Teresa. So Kyle has indicated to me that my time is almost up. I do want to point out that Teresa of Lisieux wrote a book called Soul of a Saint, Story of a Soul, which I know is published and I assume is also out there for those to look at. But with that, I think I will come to an end and allow you to ask any questions or make comments as we close. All right, I think we're good. So thank you for everybody who is watching online.
Dorothy Day wrote a biography of
Dorothy Day wrote a biography.
Teresa, which I've never read.
Okay.
But one of her projects was to write a biography of this Teresa of Lisieux. She loved this little way stuff. Can I ask a question quick?
Let's see if I can
As
answer.
a Presbyterian,
Yeah.
how did you feel researching this Catholic saint stuff? These doctors of the church. It's kind of new territory for some of us.
Yeah. I think there was some of it that just seemed very, obviously very, very different of how, we come out, especially reading the Catholic web pages about these saints and some of the practices and the different ways that these saints are celebrated and how they are incorporated into the Catholic faith as people to pray to and stuff, felt very odd and foreign to me, but at the same time, I can see that God touched these women's lives, and the teaching and the speaking that they have are truths that we all can learn and practice from. So.
Well, next week, we have Stevens here, our interim pastor, and he's going to tell us about a black Presbyterian missionary in the Congo who wrote a book about the Bible. And so he's a little known but very important Presbyterian missionary. And so Steve will be with us next week. And once again, we're going to learn about somebody we probably don't know much about to stretch our understanding of who our leaders are in the body of Christ and things we can learn from others. So join us next week. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.